Welcome, everyone, to Catalista's 2 Minutes to Midnight, the future of work. My name is Ed Goldberg, coming to you from the studios at Catalista Centrale. 2 Minutes to Midnight connects the dots between capitalism, democracy, and rapidly accelerating technology. We're using a book as our through line for the series, and the book is People Get Ready: The Fight Against a Jobless Economy and a Citizenless Democracy. The book is by Robert McChesney and John Nichols. 2M2M, The Future of Work, takes a look at specific fields and topics that impact each of us.
In this episode, we'll be looking at the future of cities with our guests Liam Young and Miguel Robles-Durán.
Liam Young is a speculative architect and film director. The BBC describes him as the man designing our futures. His work explores the boundaries between film, fiction, design, and storytelling, with the goal of prototyping and imagining the future of the city. Liam is a founder of the urban futures think tank Tomorrow's Thoughts Today, and a research studio, Unknown Fields. Let's begin with you, Liam. If the current economic system continues as is, what does the future of transportation look like?
What we're seeing is that the trends towards automation in transportation are visible. Basically, we're in a situation where automotive companies are billions and billions of dollars into automated transport. And there's nothing that, myself, trained as an architect and urbanist, or my discipline is going to be able to discover or find out and speculate on when thinking about automated transport that is going to stop this from happening. And this is an inevitability. The only thing standing in our way really is a few regulatory questions that mostly hinge around liability. A runaway car without a driver knocks over a bunch of school kids on the street corner. Who is liable? The coder that wrote the algorithm, the car company that manufactured the car, the driver sitting in the back seat. These are questions we still really don't have answers for. I mean, although we see it on the horizon, automated transport is what I would describe as a before culture technology, which is to say that the technology is actually already here. It's arrived to us faster than our cultural understanding of what it might mean. So for the most part, you see it with contemporary Teslas, cars are already entirely autonomous. We just haven't turned them on in the way that they are able to be turned on. Because again, the legal framework doesn't exist to support them yet. But the technology's here. We've figured it out. We know what needs to happen. So what we need to be doing now is kind of projecting and speculating on how life will be different, how the modern city will change, and how ourselves will change when everything becomes automated. And what it's going to mean is that the nature of the commute becomes fundamentally different. No longer is it about a trajectory which links two destinations, but in itself, the commute can be its own thing in and of itself. The journey becomes a destination. We can choose to have a meeting on the move, as opposed to getting an Uber to go to a meeting. The Uber is the meeting.
Miguel Robles-Durán is an urbanist and Associate Professor of Urbanism at the New School, Parsons School of Design in New York City. Miguel co-founded Cohabitation Strategies, a nonprofit cooperative for socio-spatial research and development. Its focus is on conditions of urban decline, inequality, and segregation within the contemporary city.
Miguel, how does a critique of capitalism and a transdisciplinary approach shade your perspective as an urbanist?
When you're dealing with urbanization, with issues of the city, you have to be an expert on one thing, and that one thing is capitalism. You have to understand what capitalism is, because capitalism ultimately is what produces the city, right? There's no city, there's no urbanization without capitalist processes, right? And that is thinking that there is nothing else that influences It's not that there are no anti-capitalist propositions, but basically the forms of organization of our society, the forms in which it organizes territory, all of them are based on capitalist processes. Right? And when you get into capitalist studies, then you realize that the only way to look into them is through a transdisciplinary perspective. Although many capitalist sort of experts on capitalism and so on don't look at it that way. I also started to encounter disciplinary determinisms in the study of Marx and capitalism. For example, when you talk to an economist that is educated on a Marxist lens, right? They would think most of the time that economy is the most important. And then you could see that historically from Althusser is one great example, right? Where dehumanize Marxism in order to make it an incredibly, let's say, a mechanical, almost scientific viewpoint of economics and society and so forth, right? Forgetting many other aspects. And that is a very common trend also among sort of left thinkers, especially the ones on capitalism. And again, if you were talking to an economist one way, and you're talking to a sociologist another, and so forth, right? And so part, I guess, of my training has been to go against the specializations in the study of cities, right? And so my entry point into the urban planning world is not an urban planning world. It's actually trying to dismantle the viewpoints, the disciplinary viewpoints, the deterministic viewpoints, the positivist directions that are part of that discipline, in this case, urban planning.
I've heard you say that neoliberal capitalism has lessons for those who would like to shift our contemporary economic framework. Can you talk about that?
One of the, if not the most important thing that all of those practitioners that are against capitalism, which I hope there are many of us, should do, is to learn to co-opt very smart strategies that neoliberalism sort of made or designed. What I mean with this is that I think neoliberalism perhaps has been one of the most successful modalities of capitalism. And one of the reasons of this is that it was completely designed and strategized. And this was done in multiple think tanks, multiple sort of meetings and associations and networks between Thatcher and Chicago school people and Jeffrey Sachs and Summers and all the economists that were involved into these. It was completely strategized, and it was very open to receive ideas from the different interests, right, around this process. So basically, the capitalists had a very good voice. They were listened to, right? Contrary to other forms of capitalism, which were more authoritative and more state-driven or more, and this, neoliberalism was very open. And I think we have to learn a lot about, what the last 40 years of, disaster, which is neoliberalism, did. What I mean by this is that they have rebuilt completely our world in 40 years. Like completely. I don't think, when I talk to my students, which were born under neoliberalism, and you see how they are, it's like they believe that, the only way that things can go forward is with private, things, with the private. It's so entrenched, it's so naturalized, right? The idea that a public space can only thrive, with the donation of a billionaire, right? Or cities can only be reproduced with, large investments of, multinational firms or banks. When you look at the way our institutions are made, the laws were made, the normatives, the regulations, the zoning arrangements. When you look into all of that was redesigned, completely redesigned by neoliberalism, right? There is nothing, I guess, in the planet at large that has not been touched by it. Even China, right? And I would argue even North Korea. So if we don't begin to learn from what our enemies are doing, or what the people we think, well, no, we don't think, we're sure are destroying our planet, are destroying humanity, and are not, they're greedy and all of that, then it will be, I think, very difficult, right, to create an opposition to it, right? We have to be able to dismantle intellectually, but also conceptually, what was done under neoliberalism. Not as a critique, because there are many critiques of neoliberalism out there. There are many, many books that have been written on it. I'm talking about learning from what they did so that we can do it better, because there is a lesson to learn there that we don't do. If you look at left organizations today, they're so fragmented. Actually, the left is just fragmented structures, whereas the neoliberals were completely united. They have obviously profit, always unites everything, right? At least under capitalism. But it is something that is quite telling of our times. Whereas the capitalist class continues to emphasize and structure networks, right? Solidarity networks. Yes, they are solidarity to each other. There's solidarity in them, right? Cooperative networks. Yes, there are cooperative networks. Collective networks. Yes, there are. All of these things are super well structured. We're super well strategized by that.
Liam, how will driverless cars impact our cities?
What we're trying to think about is what this new city will start to look like. What is the sky? What is an intersection? What is a traffic light? What is a van? So they use a mixture of sensors, LiDAR scanners, infrared sensors, and so on, in order to map and understand the city. And what this signals is a massive change in how the nature of the street, the nature of our urban spaces are actually captured. It's no longer the human eyes which are doing the looking. The dominant way that we see cities will soon be through the lens of the scanners and sensors of driverless vehicles. So it fundamentally changes how we're going to be designing. Because currently our cities are shaped and formed based around our own patterns of movement and observation. They're formed based around how we see and how we occupy space. Soon we'll start to design our environment based on how driverless cars see and understand the world. And we'll be designing our cities for non-human inhabitants, these automated creatures, as opposed to ourselves. The nature of the streetscape will totally change, because we'll start to design material systems for architecture and buildings that are designed to respond to the sensor networks of a car, as opposed to the sensations of delight that normally we design these systems for in ourselves. We'll start to select materials and forms for buildings along the street based on how they reflect laser scanners, as opposed to how we see them. We'll start to imagine a curvy building surface is problematic in computational terms to understand the extents of a space.
Miguel, thinking about a people-centric city of the future, how do we move in that direction?
So part of the task that I hope from now until, I die, is to co-opt some of these things that the capitalist class did to transform our cities. Specifically, the advising part and the dismantling of the capacity of cities to think for themselves. What I'm trying to say here is that cities now have to rely on private intelligence to take decisions. The world of advising and consultancies and basically private advising, so on, is the one that has most of the dominant ideas right now in how cities are made. Because of neoliberalism and the sort of shrinking of the capacity of government, right? Governments hardly have any research institutes that are publicly, sponsored. And if they do, they're very small and with very few resources, right? And so when there's a time to take a decision, the decision normally gets exported to, McKinsey or PricewaterhouseCoopers or some of these people. And they have become de facto, in my view, the people that decide many of the things that happen in cities, infrastructurally, energy-wise, even the views on eco-friendly stuff, and energy sort of saving things. The recommendations would be, make all the buildings LEED Platinum certified or LEED Titanium certified. And those of us that work on these things know that this is not gonna produce anything, but money for these capitalists, right? So this is, I think, a space that I'm very interested in infiltrating. we have to slowly learn how they took power and do it better. When I mean they, the capitalists, the neoliberal people, and look for spaces where we can start to redistribute that power to people, right? So if a private enterprise is taking decisions at a private advising group, right, a think tank is taking decisions, why not a people's think tank, right? And how can we transfer those resources or those decision-making resources of states and governments into people's power, right? And so a lot of the work I believe that we need to do is focusing on that transfer of who takes decisions, right? And thinking that I also don't want to see another welfare state coming back. I mean, yes, it's better than what we have right now in many cases, but it's still the idea that there's, one government deciding over the voice of the many with a very specific direction. I think there's a lot to say, and there's a reason why in France the left in the 1960s and the 1970s, from all the fragments of the left they had, they all just hated the welfare state. And this is what a lot of people in the US don't understand. It was like the decision power, the overpowering of the state having that public aspect, deciding over the livelihoods of people. So if I have to summarize these, the trend has to go from the resources of decision making right now are on the private side. In the welfare era, they were on the state side, but as a dominant state. In our new paradigm, we should start transferring that decision power to people, to collectives, to organized individuals, to social movement. And that, I think, is one of the big steps that we should take. How to empower that transfer. So my role as an urbanist is how to empower the transfer of decision-making to people.
What can accelerate a beneficial approach to cities and urbanization?
I think what Marx believed is that the revolution in itself is itself a process. And it's a process that leads you into the dominance or the slow dominance of a very different type of social relation or a different type of socioeconomic, regime. So the role that one has to play, I believe, as a person that is interested in urban issues, is not so much striving for that sort of singular moment of revolution where, we're going to fight everything, we're going to collapse the system, and then suddenly we're going to start everything again. If that ever happens, suddenly that we're going to have a cataclysmic situation, it could be. But the way we're looking at it, we'll have a slow process of global warming where many of the dynamics will change, right? Most of the planet will be, very different, but it will be very different in a gradual process, right? Another thing could happen with what I think is another of the big dangers is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is faster, will be faster than perhaps global warming in changing society. However, it will still be a process and there will be resistance and there will be a process in which, we will find those sort of two things coming upon. The role of urbanization has to, or it will be adapting to those shifts and processes. And what we do as professionals in this is to aid the acceleration of those processes that we want to change, right? Basically to provoke more frictions, to provoke more erosion in the capitalist system so that we could get faster into or accelerate the process the moment where there's a system that, prefers people over profit. I think that will happen in hundreds of years. And the role of what we do is just to begin to promote anti-capitalist practices in the city.
Liam, what's your vision for the kind of transportation that puts people and planet before profit?
My relationship to the future is one of pragmatic realism. And unfortunately, the images of an aspirational future where the big mega technology stack of Google, Apple, Amazon, and Facebook, the hoarders of the patents for the automated technologies we're talking about, give that over roll these systems out into the world with anything other than profit in mind is a leap of the imagination that I find difficult to come along with. I think what's necessary is a total reimagining of how technology gets into the world. And when we're thinking about automation, I think what we need to be doing is acknowledging that so many of the systems that govern our contemporary lives that are housed within the proprietary systems of about 4 different companies are actually fundamental public infrastructure. What we need to be acknowledging is that what we think of as being systems that come from a group of tech companies need to be understood as public infrastructure in the same way that water and power are delivered to us. So in order to imagine the vision that you're talking about, we need to reimagine our systemic relationship to technology. And we need to think about breaking up these massive, massive companies, regulating them, and imagining code as a form of public infrastructure. Because at the moment, we've outsourced so much of the systems that govern cities to proprietary algorithms. We were once citizens of a city, but now we are customers of that same city. Because the governance of the city that was once the domain of publicly elected officials has been systematically outsourced to the cloud, outsourced to the network, outsourced to algorithms engineered by very few companies that own the patents to them and protect them. And this transition has happened in plain sight through language of convenience, better connection, and making our lives easier and more simple. But really, it's been an alibi to a process of outsourcing and wealth accumulation by said technology companies. So we need to imagine a system where those algorithms actually become part of the public domain. We need to imagine a system where the top graduates from MIT don't take the big job at Google, but rather they take the job with, Kansas City Council, because that's where the real innovation happens at the level of the city. So the only way that I can see any kind of equitable future being delivered through automated technologies is if the very systems that generate those technologies shift. The nature of our experience and interface with the world is being regulated through a guy in sneakers and a hoodie. That's the real catastrophe that's waiting. We used to interface with our city and with each other and form communities through physical spaces out in the world, public squares, parks, these sorts of things that used to be the remit of architects and urbanists and local localities. That kind of public discourse has shifted and morphed into the network. Now the landscapes and the scrolling feeds of Facebook and Twitter have become the kind of public forums of our age. But those public forums are not managed by or under the remit of the same sorts of laws that govern our interactions in public space. They're governed by laws determined by the private sector. The challenge, I think, is how we can get ahead of the curve and not in 20 years' time be sitting through congressional hearings with the head of Uber after we realize just what has happened to our cities through automation. Task is really to think about how we can roll out these systems in a way that's much more akin to public infrastructure and services. That to me is the real struggle, not staving off mass unemployment. I think we should be talking about the democratization of automated technologies. I think this is really the site of our generational struggle, is figuring out how these technologies are going to be coming into our world in a way that isn't regulated by a handful of small companies that are not accountable to a public that democratically elects them, but that are accountable to the shareholders. That's the real struggle. So how can we think of automated systems in the way that we think of the public transport system? At the moment, it looks very much like the first wave of automation and in transport is going to be the likes of Uber and Lyft, which are very soon going to be figuring out a way to leave the drivers behind. At the moment, it could be said that the drivers, Uber and Lyft and so on, are already automated machines. Their employers are algorithms. Their bodies have been repurposed as machines, as driving machines. they're not necessarily making their own choices. They can choose when to turn the app on or off, but everything else is decided by the algorithm. Where they go, how they drive, the route they take, the amount of money they make is all engineered by an automated system. They're already the human labor extension of automation. And very soon, those drivers are just going to be displaced. And it's just going to cut out the middleman instead of, meaty human hands on the wheel in the service of the algorithm. It's just going to be the algorithm in itself deciding when to turn and when to pull up in front of the bill that you're standing in front of. And what we're not going to get to is talking about public infrastructure, like public transport. And until these private companies lead the charge, they're going to bring these technologies into the world because they're going to be able to make more money out.
Miguel, I know you've given this a lot of thought. Could you share your thinking on a transition beyond neoliberal capitalism?
Now, we're promoting anti-capitalist practices, which are practices that deal with non-speculative property systems, for example, or collectivized farming structures, or cooperativized sort of trading in a network, a global network issues, right? Which are somehow providing tools and ideas for society to sort of get more accustomed to them, to accelerate the process where the moment that those practices become more dominant than the for-profit practices that are today. So to the demise of a lot of perhaps viewers or people that follow me or have read me or that believe that change will happen within a generation towards an absolutely cities for people and not for profit, I would say that's not possible, and it will never be possible. I mean, if you look at the historical currents, we still have feudal structures in the capitalist, system. And I believe that as we advance into some form of socialism or later communism, or however you want to call it, there will still be traits of feudalism and there will still be traits of capitalism within it. However, what we have to strive for is a moment where there's more dominance of the prioritization of use values and of people, and of course of the planet, right? And this will happen, and perhaps it won't happen the way we think it will happen. If the social dynamics of prioritizing people over profit are present, our cities would look completely different. Because our cities right now are a reflection of the capitalist processes of prioritizing profit over. And so the construction of a city would be, I cannot see skyscrapers the way I see them now. I cannot see even the things that we love about cities, the public parks, right? The public spaces. All of those things have to disappear because they are there because they're part of the capitalist system that created them, right? When we look at a different way of social reproduction, obviously it has to reproduce a very different kind of space, right? And that is a great exercise for everyone to do in their mind.
What would a post-capitalist city look like?
What would cities look like, right? And they will not be anything like the things we have around us. I was talking yesterday to a friend of mine. One of the first commissions I received as a professional was working with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. I was kind of in charge of visualizing the socialist city of the 21st century, right? And it was a crazy project. I mean, I worked there for 3 years. I was going back and forth. I was living in the Netherlands at the time. And it was that idea that Chavez had that, that you could produce a city in a political period, in his, whatever, moment. And it's like this incapacity of people to think that a city is a representation of a long-term process, right? And that you cannot just build a socialist city like in the middle of capitalism dominant. I mean, it's just impossible, right? I don't think that's possible. And I was stressing all the time, look, we have to accept that it has to be a capitalist city. However, we could prioritize different channels of trade and, goods and so on, so that they slowly start to take over, right? But no, these crazy people in Venezuela wanted something now, like the Soviets. I mean, the Soviets tried to build those cities and, I don't think they were as successful as people would say.
Liam, can we ask you to share a few final thoughts?
So what we need to be looking at is how we can support that privatized network with an expanded field of public infrastructure and public transport, how some of these technologies can be in the hands of governments, not in the hands of the private sector, and how, power went and made the transition from a few privatized power companies to being seen as being a public amenity, a public service. That's what needs to happen with automation. It needs to be seen as being as vital to human existence as a clean water supply. But again, we need to be talking about the monopoly on these technologies in the same way that we'll be talking about the monopoly on water companies. But in summary, yes, I think the front line of the discourse and the debate around automated technologies needs to be companies that are bringing them into the world and how they can be democratized and how the IP can be freed solely within their remit and mandate and can be treated as a form of public code and public infrastructure.
Thank you for joining us for 2 Minutes to Midnight, The Future of Work. And thanks to our guests, Miguel Robles-Durán and Liam Young. You can find Catalista on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, where your comments and likes are always appreciated. 2 Minutes to Midnight, The Future of Work was edited by Joshua Cash, Christina Hiramoto, Chris Porro, and Carl Robinson Jr. The mix is by Chris Porro. Our music is composed by John Askew. The executive producers are Chicky Munch and Binny Bunny Munch, with assistance from Ed Goldberg and Gerald Gerbil. This is Ed Goldberg signing off from the studios at Catalista Centrale. See you next time.